I think we should talk, she said. I looked up from my phone. You sound serious? She folded her hands on the table. I am serious, I said. Okay. She took a breath. I don't think this marriage works anymore. I laughed once. That's not a conversation starter. She didn't smile. I'm not joking. I leaned back. Then start again, she said. You're holding me back. But from what? My future. I said, we built that future together. She shook her head. You helped me once. You don't help me now. I said I stayed home. So you could travel. She replied, that was your choice. I said, I turned down jobs for you. She said, I never asked you to. I felt my chest tighten. You needed support. She said, I needed a partner who could keep up. I asked, keep up with money? With ambition? She said. I said, I believed in you before anyone else did. She said, and I'm grateful for that. I asked, then why does this sound like a goodbye? She reached into her bag. Because it is. She placed a folder on the table. I stared at it. What's that? An agreement. I said, for what? For us to end this cleanly? I opened the folder slowly. My name was already printed. I said, you planned this. She said I had to. I asked how long? Long enough, she said. I flipped a page. You already talked to lawyers, yes, I said, while I was fixing the roof. She didn't answer. I said, while I was cooking your dinners? She said, please don't do that. Do what? I asked. Make this emotional. I laughed again. You brought divorce papers? She slid a check forward. I stared at the number. I said, what is this? Compensation. For what? I asked for leaving quietly. Said, you're paying me to disappear. She said, I'm protecting us both. I said, you're buying silence, she replied. I'm offering security. I pushed the check back. I don't want it. She pushed it toward me again. You need it. I said, I need my wife. Looked away. I'm not that anymore. I asked, when did I become a problem? She said, when I stopped being proud to introduce you. I swallowed because I don't wear suits. Because you talk about soil and seasons, she said. I said, you loved that about me. I outgrew it, she replied. I said, you outgrew me. She said, I evolved. I leaned forward. You climbed on my back. She said, that's unfair. I said, I funded your first office. She said, you believed in me. Said, I emptied my savings. She said, I paid you back. I asked, with what? With this? She said, tapping the check. I said, you're reducing 10 years to a number. She said, I'm being practical. I said, you're being cruel? She sighed. I can't carry guilt into my next life, I asked, so I'm baggage. She said, your weight? The word hit harder than the check. I said, say it again. She didn't. I said, say I'm worthless. She whispered, you don't add value anymore. I nodded slowly. That's worse, she said. Please sign. I said, if I don't, she said, this will get messy. I asked, you'd destroy me? She said, I'd protect myself. I laughed quietly. You already did. She slid the pen closer. My hand shook. I said, you rehearsed this. She said, I had to be prepared. She said, did you rehearse my face? She looked at me then. I didn't expect you to look like that. Like what? I asked. Small, she said. I swallowed again. I said, I built everything around you. She said, I never asked you to. I said, you let me. She said, you chose to. I asked, was any of it real? She paused. It was real then and now. I asked. She said, now I need space. I said, you need erasure. She didn't deny it. I said, you're ashamed of me. She nodded once. That nod broke something. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. I said, do you love me? She said. I don't know who you are anymore, I said. I'm the same man. She said, that's the problem. I closed my eyes. I remembered her crying in our old kitchen. I remembered holding her hand during her first pitch. I remembered saying, we'll survive. I opened my eyes. I said, you never came back. She said, I moved forward. I picked up the pen. She exhaled in relief. I said, "You already told people, didn't you?" She said, "I prepared statements." I smiled weakly. "You erased me everywhere." She said, "This is better for you." I said, "You don't get to decide that." She said, "I already did." My hand hovered over the paper. I said, "If I sign, I vanish." She said, "You'll be taken care of." I said, "I'll be forgotten." She didn't argue. I signed. The pen scratched softly. My name looked strange. She gathered the papers quickly. She said, "Thank you for understanding." I laughed. "You paid me to die quietly." She stood up. "I wish you well," I said. "You don't." She paused. "I hope you find peace." I said, "I hope you remember." She didn't turn back. I sat alone. The check lay on the table. I stared at it. I said to myself, "This is what I'm worth." I folded it slowly. I stood up. I walked out. I didn't look back. I stood at the bus stop with one bag and one envelope. The driver asked, "You getting on or just thinking about it?" I said, "I'm getting on." He nodded. "City, no," I said. "The opposite." He didn't ask more. I sat by the window and watched the buildings thin out. I said to myself, "This is what disappearing feels like." The check was still folded in my pocket. I didn't look at it. A man across the aisle said, "Long ride?" I said, "Long life," laughed. "Ain't we all?" I got off at the last stop. There was no station, just dirt, wind, and silence. I walked until my legs burned. The land sign leaned sideways. My name was spelled wrong, I said. Figures. The fence was broken. I kicked it lightly. It collapsed, I said. "You always said this place would wait for me." I could hear my father's voice in my head. He said, "Land doesn't leave. People do." I dropped my bag. I sat on a rock. I said out loud, "She was right, wasn't she?" No one answered. I pulled out my phone. No messages. I deleted her number. My hands shook. I said, "You paid me to vanish." The house was smaller than I remembered. The door stuck. I pushed harder. Inside smelled like dust and time. I said, "It back." The echo sounded weak. I checked the sink. No water. I laughed once. I said, "Of course." That night I slept on the floor. The wind came through the cracks. I said, "I won't disappear." In the morning I walked to town. The clerk looked at me and said, "You're late." "For what?" "I asked for leaving," he said. I smiled thinly. "I sold my watch." He said, "This worth something to you?" I said, "It used to be." Counted the bills. I didn't. Outside, an old man watched me. He said, "You're her husband." I said, "I was." He spat. "Thought you'd have better shoes." I said, "Me too." He laughed. "Name's Tom." I said, "I know." He said, "Your father fixed my roof once." I said, "He never charged." Tom nodded. "That tracks." He looked at the land papers. He said, "You keeping that dump?" I said, "It's all I have." He said, "Then it's enough." I didn't believe him. Back at the farm I fixed the fence with wire. My hands bled. I said, "You told me this would be hard." My father's voice said, "Hard doesn't mean wrong." I worked until my back screamed. I fell. I stayed there. I said, "I can't do this." The dirt stuck to my palms. I said, "I won't disappear." Days blurred. I ate little. I talked to myself. I said she would laugh at this. I fixed the roof with scrap. It leaked anyway. I said, "Good enough." Tom came by one afternoon. Said, "You look like hell." I said, "I feel worse." He handed me a bottle. I said, "I don't drink." He said, "You do now." I took a sip. "It burned," I said. She said I was worthless. Tom snorted. "Land don't lie," I asked. "About what?" "Work," he said. "It gives back what you give." I said, "What if I gave everything already?" He said, "Then give quieter." I planted seeds with no plan. I said, "Grow or don't." I waited. I doubted. I dreamed of her voice. I said, "You don't add value." I woke angry. I said, "I'm still here." Weeks passed. Green broke the soil. I stared at it. I said, "You came back." Tom smiled. "Told you." I knelt. My hands shook again. I said, "This is mine." The wind moved the leaves. I heard my father. He said, stand up. He did. I said, I won't disappear. I harvested one basket. It wasn't much. It was real. I smiled. I said I stayed. I heard her name on the radio first. The announcer said, visionary, billionaire, self-made. I turned the volume down. Tom looked at me and said, that your wife? I said, X. He whistled. World's small. I said, smaller win. You stay put. The farm was steady by then, Tom said. You're doing good? I said. I'm doing enough, he asked. You happy? I said, I'm quiet. My body hurt less. My mind hurt different. I carried crates like they weighed nothing. I carried memories like they weighed everything. Tom said, town's buzzing today. I asked, about what? About her, he said. I kept tying the rope. He said, they say she bought another company. I said, good for her. He squinted. You don't mean that. I said, I don't mean anything. In town, the screen above the diner played her interview. She said, success requires sacrifice. A woman beside me said, she's inspiring. Paid for my coffee. The cashier said, you look familiar. I said, I'm not. Outside, a man said, you know her, right? I said, I used to. He grinned. You should talk, I said. About what? About how she climbed, he said. I said, she climbed alone. He laughed. Nobody does. I walked away. My phone buzzed that night. Unknown number. It said you could tell your side. I deleted it. Tom saw me later. He said, you're quiet again, I said. I stayed quiet. He said people would listen. I said, I don't need them to. He said, you sure? I said, I'm sure of myself. Weeks passed. Her face showed up everywhere. Magazine covers, billboards, people. Said her name like a prayer. I said it once alone. It tasted old. Tom said, you angry? I said I was. He said, and now? Careful, I said. One afternoon, a car stopped by the fence. A woman stepped out. She said, is this your land? I said, it is. She smiled politely. I represent a company, I said. Which one? My chest tightened. My chest tightened. I said, what do you want? Said expansion. I laughed once. She said, I'm serious. I said, so am I. She handed me a card. I didn't take it. She said, we'll be in touch. I said, I doubt it. That night, Tom asked, who was that? Said the future. Said, you scared? I said, no. I was lying. I dreamed of boardrooms and checks. I woke up calm. I said, not this time. The radio said her net worth again. I turned it off. Tom said, you could make noise. I said, noise fades. He said, silence scares people. I watched the fields. I said, I scare myself less now. A week later, another call came. A man said, we'd like to talk. I said, about your land, he said. I said, it's not for sale. He paused. Everything is. I said, not me. He laughed nervously. I hung up. Tom said, you poking a giant? I said, I'm standing still. He nodded slowly. News spread. People looked at me differently. Some smiled. Some whispered. A kid said, that's him. I said, that's me. 8-1. Man said, you deserve credit. I said, I deserve peace. He frowned. I went home. I sat on the porch. I heard my father's voice. He said, quiet strength lasts. I said, I learned. The phone rang again. I didn't answer. The message said, this is important. I deleted it. Tom said, you sure? I said, I chose silence. He said, silence can be loud. I said, I know. The car returned. This time it stayed. A man stepped out. He said, she wants that land. I said, she doesn't get it. He said, she always gets what she wants. I looked at the fields. I said, not everything. He said, we'll be back. I watched him leave. My hands were steady. I said, power isn't money. The wind moved the crops. I stayed silent. Her shoes sank into the mud before she said my name. She said, I didn't expect this. I said, you came anyway. She looked down at her shoes. They were expensive. I said, they still are. She sighed. You always did that. I asked. Say things that sound calm but cut, she said. I shrugged. I learned from you. She looked around the farm. You kept it, I said. You left it. She nodded once. I thought it would rot. I said, you thought? Wrong. She took a step forward and almost slipped. I didn't move, she said. You could have warned me. I said, about the ground. About everything, she said. I said, you paid me to disappear. Her jaw tightened. I paid you to survive. I laughed softly. You paid me to be quiet. She looked at me. You were always quiet. I said, you like that when it helped you? She flinched. She said, can we talk? I said, we are. She held out her hand. Professionally. I didn't shake it. She lowered it slowly. She said, my company needs this land. I said, you always need something. She said, this time it's critical. I asked, for who? For me, she said. I studied her face. She looked tired, not poor, not broken, just tired. I said, sit. She hesitated. Here, lest you prefer the mud, I said. She sat on the crate. She said, you look different. I said, you look expensive. She smiled sadly. I don't feel it. I said, why are you here? She said, I can't move forward without your signature. I said, that sounds familiar. She closed her eyes. Please don't do that. I said, you did it first. She opened her eyes. I'm not here to fight. I said, you came armed. She frowned. With what? Need, I said. She swallowed. Yes. I felt something stir. Not joy, not anger, control, she said. They're suing me. I said, who? Partners, she said. Former ones, I said. Like me, she winced. Not like you. I said, you're alone now. She nodded. I didn't think I would be, I said. You traded people for numbers, she whispered. I thought numbers were safer. I crossed my arms. And they don't stay, she said. I said, neither did you. She rubbed her temples. I didn't sleep last night. I said I didn't sleep for years. She looked at the field. You made this work? I said. I worked. She said, you could have sold. I said, you would have liked that. She said, I would have understood. I shook my head. You never understood. She stood up suddenly. What do you want from me? I said nothing. She laughed, sharp and tired. That's not true. I said, I already took what I needed. She asked, what was that? My life, I said. Silence stretched. The sun pressed down. She said I was wrong. I didn't answer. She said, I know apologies don't fix things, I said. They don't, she said. I know money doesn't either. I looked at her. You learned late. She nodded. Too late. She stood and kicked off her shoes. I raised an eyebrow. She said, if you want proof, watch. She stepped into the field barefoot. I said, you don't have to. She said, I do. She grabbed a tool wrong. I said, that'll blister. Said, let it. She worked badly. She sweated quickly. She cursed under her breath. I said nothing. After a while, she said, I forgot how hard this is. I said, you never knew. She paused. That's fair. Her hand shook. She said, I thought power would protect me. I said, it isolates. She nodded. I see that now. She wiped her face. Do you hate me? I thought about it. I said, I remember you. She said, that's worse. I said, maybe. She stumbled and caught herself. I said, slow down. She snapped, I'm not fragile. I said, you are human. She laughed weakly. I forgot that too. We worked in silence. The sun climbed. Her shoulders sagged. She said, I used to be proud of you. I said, you used to be kind. Whispered, I miss that woman. I said, so do I. She dropped the tool. She sat in the dirt. She said, I can't fix this, can I? I said, you can stop breaking things. She looked up. Is that enough? I said, it's a start. She nodded slowly. She said, I don't deserve forgiveness. I said, that's honest. Will you sell? I said no. Her shoulders fell. I said, but I'll talk. She looked up sharply. You will? I said, on my terms? She exhaled like she'd been underwater. She said, thank you. I said, don't thank me yet. She stood again. She went back. To work, the sun burned. Her hands blistered. She didn't stop. I watched. I said nothing. For the first time, she worked under my sky. She stood at the edge of the field while the sky began to lighten. She said I couldn't sleep. I said neither could I. She held her hands together. I stayed because I needed to finish something. I asked, what? She said, this. I looked at her. Say it. She swallowed. I need forgiveness. I didn't answer. She rushed on. Not for business. Not for the land. I said, then for what? So I can breathe, she said. I felt the weight of the morning. Settle on me, I said. You didn't come here for peace. She said, I didn't know how much I needed it. I leaned against the fence. I said, you always wanted control. She nodded. I lost it. I said, you gave it away. She flinched. I know. She looked at the fields. I thought, winning would feel different, I said. Winning what? Everything, she said. I asked, and she shook her head. It's empty. I watched the sun push higher, I said. You once told me I added no value. Her eyes filled. I was wrong. I said you were cruel. She whispered yes. I said you paid me to disappear. She said I thought money could soften it. I said it sharpened it. She nodded slowly. She said I don't expect forgiveness. I said then why ask? She said because carrying this is killing me. I crossed my arms. It almost killed me too. She met my eyes. I see that now. I said, you didn't see me, she said. I see you. I laughed quietly. You're late. She stepped closer. Tell me what to do. I said, stop asking me to save you. She froze. I said, I already saved myself. She whispered. I don't know how, I said. You don't need to. She frowned. What does that mean? I said, it means this ends here. She said, you won't sell. I said, not outright. Her shoulders slumped. I continued, I'll lease part of the land. She looked up sharply. On your terms. Yes. I said. She nodded. I expected worse. I said, that's your guilt talking. She said, you could destroy me. I said, I don't need to. She searched my face. Why not? It said, because I already won. She let out a shaky breath. She said, you're different. I said, you made me. She shook her head. I broke you, I said. You revealed me. Silence stretched between us. Birds moved in the trees. She said, will you ever forgive me? I thought carefully. I said, forgiveness isn't a gift. She listened. I said, it's a choice I make every day. She nodded. So today. I said, today, I choose myself. Tears rolled down her face. She said, that's fair. I said, fair is all I offer now. She wiped her cheeks. I deserve this. I said, deserve has nothing to do with it. She asked, what happens to me? I said, you live with your choices. She winced. That's harder than punishment. I said, it was for me too. She took a step back. She said, I'm proud of you, I replied. That doesn't matter anymore. She nodded. I know. She turned toward her car. She stopped. I'm sorry, I said. I heard you. She hesitated. Is that enough? I said. It is today. She walked away slowly. I watched until she was gone. The field was quiet. The sky was fully awake. I stood alone. I said out loud. Oh, God. I didn't disappear. The wind moved through the crops. I remembered the man I was. I remembered the man I became. I said, I took my life back. The sun rose. I stayed.